In this lecture, we'll be talking about the short-run trade-off between inflation and unemployment. So far, in the classes that we have gone through, we've discussed different types of inflations and unemployments. Now, the purpose of this lesson is going to be to figure out the relationship between inflation and unemployment. To explain the relationship between inflation and unemployment, we'll be discussing something called the Phillips curve in today's lecture. And basically, what we're trying to do is we want to figure out how these two things are actually related. And the Phillips curve basically explains this relationship. And according to the Phillips curve, inflation, which is depicted by a pie in this lecture, and unemployment, you'll find two of them. One of them is going to be the current unemployment in the economy. The second one is going to be the natural rate of unemployment that we've discussed earlier, are actually inversely related in the short run. So this guy, Phillips, in the 1950s, he actually decided to figure out what the correlation between inflation and unemployment was. And in doing so, he found out that if you were to plot inflation and unemployment on a graph, it looks like a downward sloping curve, which is called the Phillips curve. Before we actually go into the detail about this whole thing, we want to discuss what the implications of this downward sloping curve is. So what this curve basically is saying, that the government or the policymakers can actually choose to be in a position where there is high inflation and low unemployment, versus a scenario in which inflation is low but unemployment is higher. Which means that policymakers have a set of combinations of inflation and unemployment available to them to choose from. If you talk about Pakistan in particular, you'll find that during People's Party's tenures, normally you find that unemployment goes down and inflations are high. They, as a government policy, want to be over here on the Phillips curve. Whereas some other government which does not want to have high inflation in the economy might choose to be on point P. On point P, what would be happening would be that the inflation levels would be low, but the trade off over here is that unemployments are going to be high. This is the main crux of the Phillips curve. It's basically saying that there is a short run trade off between inflation and unemployment, which policymakers can actually use and decide to be on a particular combination of inflation and unemployment on the Phillips curve. And in order to move from point A to point B, the policymakers can actually use their monetary and fiscal policy to actually get the economy to move from one point to the other. So that being said, what we need to do first is we want to first derive the Phillips curve. So in order to derive the Phillips curve, we want to go back to the ASAD model, and we'll be using that to actually figure out how the Phillips curve is derived. So if you recall, the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model was the relationship between price levels and unemployment and GDP. So the ASAD model was showing us the relationship between price levels and GDP, and you could also see unemployment over here. And we had an aggregate demand curve. Besides this, we had an aggregate supply curve and a long run aggregate supply curve as well. For this lecture's purpose, what we'll be doing is we'll be discussing I'll be only making the short run aggregate supply curve, and I'll be assuming that the the prices in the short run aren't sticky, which means that the short run aggregate supply curve would be like a normal supply curve that you've studied in your microeconomics as well. The economy is at equilibrium at point A over here, and at point A the GDP is y bar, and let's say the unemployment rate at y bar is 4%, and the price levels are, let's say, 102. Now, what the government can do, or the central bank can do, is, if you recall, they can actually move the aggregate demand curve up or down by changing the money supply. So let's assume that in this case the government decides that we're increasing the money supply. When the government increases money supply, what happens is that your aggregate demand moves forward. When your aggregate demand moves forward, what happens is that a new equilibrium is decided, and at this new equilibrium, price levels are higher. Let's call them 105, and GDP increases. When GDP increases, unemployment falls. Let's say it falls to 3%. So now, coming to the Phillips curve. So we said the Phillips curve was basically the relationship between inflation, price levels, persistent increase in price levels, and unemployment. So what we want to do over here is we want to plot these combinations of unemployment and inflation on this axis. And so what we do is we say that at point A, the price levels were 102 and unemployment level was 4%. So you said this is the point where the economy was initially. You had price levels of 102 and unemployment was at 4%. When the government moves the aggregate demand forward to this new aggregate demand, what happens is prices increase to 105, but unemployment falls to 3%. And if you plot this over here, this new point over here, this is the new combination of price levels and unemployment. Connecting these 2 points gives you the Phillips curve. Now that we've come up with the Phillips curve, we figured out how it's derived. So basically what we've said is, whenever the aggregate demand moves, you move from one point to the other. Movement of the aggregate demand results in movement along the Phillips curve. And in the beginning, when this idea was introduced, it seemed like a very novel idea that the government would have a set of combinations available to them of unemployment and inflation, from which they could actually choose from. But when people started to investigate this phenomena further, they they found that sometimes this curve would shift, held in the short run, which basically means that all the combinations would now change. Relationship did not actually hold. Next, we try to figure out what causes the Phillips curve to actually shift. The Phillips curve, we want to figure out what factors actually affect the Phillips curve. And in order to figure out these factors, what we're going to be doing is we'll try to come up with an equation for this inverse relationship and try to use that to explain what causes movement along the Phillips curve and what causes shifts in the Phillips curve. So this Phillips curve can be written in an equation form in the following way. Your pi is your inflation, and inflation is equal to minus a constant unemployment minus your natural unemployment rate. This minus a explains the responsiveness of a change in unemployment to inflation. So basically, this minus a is telling you the slope of the Phillips curve, plus pi e. We'll discuss this further in detail, but this pi e represents expectation about inflation, plus nu. This over here is nu, and nu represents a supply shock. If you take a look at this equation, you'll find that this equation is pretty similar to a linear equation that we studied in our um, mathematics class. This y over here is our inflation. Then this c component is basically these two guys over here, which is expectation and of inflation and supply shocks. And the slope of the Phillips curve is represented by minus a, and your x variable over here is unemployment minus your natural rate of unemployment. So let's suppose that there is a case in which a particular economy is not facing any kind of supply shock. Its value is 0. Let's just say that you're expecting inflation to be 12%. And besides that, let's just say, since this is a, let's call the slope 1. This is just to help with the maths. And your unemployment currently prevailing in the economy is 8%. 8%. You subtract it from your natural rate, let's suppose it's 4%. And that is how you figure out the inflation in the economy. So this is minus becomes a plus, minus 4, sorry, this is 4, minus 4, and minus 4, and this becomes 8. So in the economy, the inflation is going to be 8%. What happens if for some reason suddenly people start to expect that because of, say, mismanagement of the government, inflation is going to be higher? What if they suppose that this expectation of inflation in the economy is 20%? What happens to the actual inflation? If expectation of inflation is 20%, 20 minus 4 should give you an inflation rate of 16%. This pi by the way is actual inflation. So pi is telling you how firms are expecting inflation, what their expectation of inflation is. So from this, what we should be concluding is that expectation about inflation has a significant impact in actually creating inflation. If people expect high inflation to happen in an economy, they would probably want to hold on to their product. When they'll hold on to their product and not supply it, there's going to be a shortage in the market, which would eventually result in inflation going up. Now, the second factor that impacts inflation. The second factor over here is the supply shock. If we talk about this scenario once again, which we were expecting 12% inflation, and there wasn't a supply shock happening in the economy, and then we had said that this was the case. Unemployment was 8%, the natural rate of the economy was 4%, and we were having an 8% unemployment in the economy. Sorry, this is oops. This is a minus sign over here, and this was giving us an 8% inflation rate. What happens if there is a supply shock, and a supply shock worth say 4? When there's a supply shock, what happens is this becomes 16 minus 4, which means inflation goes up. So whenever there are negative supply shocks happening in the economy, prices of things go up. So to sum it up, what we're saying is that inflation is affected by two things: your expectation about inflation, and the second thing is the supply shock. This was expectation. In both the cases, what happens to the Phillips curve is, so this was your Phillips curve, the original one. If expectation about inflation goes up, what happens is this curve moves up. You have a new Phillips curve. If the expectation about inflation goes down, this Phillips curve moves inwards, and you have a different Phillips curve. Similarly, whenever there is a supply shock in the economy, what happens is, in case of a supply shock, which means your nu goes up, it causes your Phillips curve to shift. So basically what we're trying to say over here is that there are two factors that cause the Phillips curve to shift. The first one is expectation of inflation, and the second one is supply shocks. Welcome back. So in this section of the video, we'll be talking about the Phillips curve in the long run. But before we start, I'd like to recap what we've done so far. Till this point, we've discussed the fact that the Phillips curve is basically the relationship between inflation rate and unemployment in the short run, and it basically gives policymakers a combination of inflation and unemployment rate to choose from. However, these combinations of inflation rates and unemployment rates are impacted by other factors, which include expectation of inflation and supply shocks. What is important to remember is that this inverse relationship holds specifically for the short run only. In the long run, there is this inverse relationship does not hold. In this short video, we'll be discussing why the Phillips curve does not hold in the long run. We'll start off by trying to recall the equation of the Phillips curve, that by inflation was impacted by expectation of inflation and supply shocks, and besides that, it was impacted by difference between unemployment and the natural rate of unemployment. This equation using maths can be transformed into another form, and this u is, which is your unemployment, is basically equal to your natural rate of unemployment, p your actual inflation minus expectation of inflation, and then you have supply shock, but for simplicity's sake, we're not actually including it, and that the supply shock is a short-term phenomenon. Now that we've come up with this equation, what this equation is basically saying is that the unemployment rate in an economy is actually, uh, in the long run, going to be coming back to its natural rate. This is called the natural rate hypothesis. It says that in the long run, all economies have to come back to their natural rate, and if you recall, their natural rate was a combination of structural unemployment and frictional unemployment, and these two unemployments persist in the long run in the economy. And this happens because in the long run, your expectation about about inflation becomes equal to the actual inflation in the long run. And once these two become equal, when pi becomes equal to your pi e, this means that this portion of this equation becomes 0, which means that unemployment rates are actually equal to the natural rate of unemployment. What it means is that if you were to draw the Phillips curve in the long run with inflation on the y-axis and unemployment rate on the x-axis, you'd find that in the long run the Phillips curve looks something like this. In the long run, irrespective of the inflation rate, the economy maintains the natural rate of unemployment. This is it for the Phillips curve. I'll see you in the next video.